is Kuf Zayin, I believe, in Masechet Chullin, moving along. And we are up to, I think, the fifth line or sixth line on the top of Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph, Omer of Papa. So the topic we got into, I hope that's where you're up to, Miriam. The
Uh,
topic,
where are you starting?
the sixth line from Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. I hope I have the right
There's
down.
a period after Darav. Ayin Darav.
Oh wow, no, I did not get there. Okay,
Um,
it's all right. I'll catch up.
okay, we can do it at the end if you want, but it's the same sugya, that right? The sugya we've been talking about is washing your hands or dipping your hands, netilat yadayim or tfilat yadayim. And says Rav Papa, the complicated case, which I'm going to try to explain to my best understanding. Hi, I'm Rav Papa, 6 lines from the top. Hi, Arita Didalai. This Arita, which is a pipe, Rashi says, that you use for transferring, basically. So what they did was there was a river running by the field. The river obviously didn't go into the field, but they would dig irrigation ditches in the field, and then they would communicate. They would have a transfer where you sort of put a spigot, a little pipe that connected the river to the irrigation pipe. So if you do that and you basically take liquid from the river and you connect it to the irrigation pipe, the water in the irrigation pipe is not considered to be flowing water from the river because it's narrow or because it's only done because of your effort. And ein notzlin mimenu liyadayim. You can't actually use this if you dip your hands into it for netilat yadayim. Delo atu mikoach gavra, because it's not considered to come from human force because the human basically turned on the spigot at the top of the row. If you dip your hands in it down the row, it's not considered to be the same force of the person. However, mikriv lagabe dula, if you put your hands near the spigot, near where it actually makes the connection between the river and the irrigation ditch, that would be okay. That would be fine. Dika'atu mikoch gavra, where it comes from the human effort. Notalimimenu liyadayim. There you can actually wash your hands with it. So if you put your hands into it closer to the top, that's considered to be from the pressure of the person, right? Imagine like a person's pouring it or causing it to be poured. If it's right where they did that effort, it's considered to be they washed your hands for you or you washed it under their effort. If it's further down the row, further down where the water is running, it's not considered to be netilat yadayim. However, says the Gemara, the bezia dula, right? Bikonis mashke. If the I don't really know how to translate dula, but like the pipe, I guess the connection has a hole in it. It's pierced in the sense that actually water can go into it. Bikonis mashke, that water can actually go into this pipe, meaning on both ends. So then melif laifi, you can actually bring it umatzbil bat yadayim. You can actually dip your hands into it. Meaning, we're going to see why in a second, that essentially if the pipe that you use to connect the river to the irrigation ditch, we'll call it, has a actual hole in the back of it that water can enter into that pipe. So it's not just a diversion, or it's not just you're taking out the water and pouring it in so that it's a bucket. It's actually a hole that's going through. Then it's considered to be an open connection. And once you have an open connection to the river, then the water running through the irrigation ditch is actually part of the river, right? And like we learned earlier, you can actually dip your hands into a river and count as tfilat yadayim. And some say you make a different bracha of al tfilat yadayim, but that would be kosher. So if the connection had a hole in it large enough that water can enter basically both ways, comes in and goes out, then it actually connects this ditch to the river, and then you're allowed to put your hands into it. Umatzbil ba et yadayim, you can actually dip your hands into it. And says Rava, similar concept. I'm a Rava, kli shenikev bikones mashke, a kli, a vessel, a washing cup, or any kind of vessel, it has a hole in it in the bottom large enough that water can enter into it, right? So, which means not a minuscule hole, but a decent sized hole. Ein notzlin mimenu liyadayim. You can't actually use that cup to pour out for netilat yadayim, right? We all know this halacha. If you take a cup and there's a hole in it, even though it contains enough water that the hole only leaches out slowly and you can pour it on your hands, that's not kosher. So the cup you use has to be for netilat yadayim has to be whole. However, in this case, because it's connecting the river to the stream actually becomes part of the river, and you could actually dip your hands into the stream, though you couldn't actually use this container to pour onto your hands since the container has a hole in it. So you can do Tfilat Yadayim and not Netilat Yadayim. Furthermore, says Rava, around 12 lines down, Kli she'ein bo revi'it. Let's say you have a cup that doesn't contain a revi'it of water, right? We have not discussed, and we're not going to really discuss how much water you have to pour on your hand when you do Netilat Yadayim, right? You pour some water. We talked before about how far up the hand you have to do it, but not how much water. Says Rava, he's not going to tell you how much water, but he says if the Kli does not have a revi'it, and a revi'it, I'm going to say, let's say around 3.5 ounces, make Charlie happy. That's one of the shiurim, I think, right? I think it's 3.3 is Reb Chaim Naz shir, something like that. Let's say 3.5 ounces. If it doesn't have that much in it, ein notzlim mimenu liyadayim. You cannot use that kli and that water to wash your hands. It's not enough water. Says the Gemara, is that true? Eini, is that true? V'amar Rava, another statement of Rava was, kli she'ein machzik revi'it, ein notzlim mimenu liyadayim. A cup that doesn't contain a revi'it, meaning not that it has to have a revi'it in it, it has to be big enough that, let's say it's 6 ounces big and you have 3 ounces of water in there, this implies that it would be okay to wash with it, right? The only problem is if the cup is 3 ounces. But if the cup is big enough, here Rava says, it has to be machzik, it has to contain a revi'it, implying hamachzik, if it does contain if it could contain a revi'it, afagav deletbe. Even if it doesn't have a revi'it, that would be enough to wash with. So if you had a 6-ounce cup and it was filled with 3 ounces of water, according to the second language of Rava, it seems like that would be okay. How do you explain this? Enters the Gemara, Lokashia halachad halatrei. You're right. It is true that you actually don't need a revi'it, but that's only if you have multiple people involved. Meaning, Titania, as the Braita says, may revi'it, if you have water that's exactly a revi'it. Again, let's use our 3.5 ounces or whatever measure we use. Notlin liyadayim le'echad. You can use that to wash hands for one person. Ve'afilu l'shnayim, but you could actually even do it for 2 people, right? And so what you see from here is, Rashi explains, is that, and it's not so simple, but Rashi explains it this way, that as long as the cup contains a revi'it, you can actually use that. Let's say you have 6 ounces in the cup. One person can use 3 ounces, and the next person can use the next 3 ounces. So even though when the second person used it, there were only 3 ounces, which is less than a revi'it, since it started off as a revi'it, that's okay. But when Rava said you have to have a revi'it, that means if you're the first person, right? So if you have just 3 ounces in a cup, then it would not be okay, even for one person. But if you have multiple people, as long as it started more than a revi'it, it's okay. Okay, not so clear exactly why, but presumably something like it's chashiv once it started off at the higher amount. So that's the Braita, and that supports what Rava said. Amalei Rav Sheshet la'Meimar. Now Rav Sheshet asked Ameimar when he was sort of, going, he met him and he asked him the questions. And the first question was, Kaptito amanna. Do you really care about what container you'd use for Netilat Yadayim? Meaning, does it matter to you if it's got a hole in it or if it's not nice? Amalei in. He said, yeah, of course I care, right? As we learned earlier today. It matters. You have to have a proper cup. The second question he asked him was, do you care achazuta? Do you care about how it appears, meaning the water? Right? Can you have to have clear water, or would you even be okay with murky water or dirty water? Amalei in. Yeah, I care. So he asked him, Ashiura, do you care about the measurement? Meaning, does it have to have a minimum size of revi'it? Amalei, he said, in. I care. So he cares about the cup being full, about the water being clean, and about there being a revi'it in the cup. Ikeda Amri, some say that in fact he didn't care. Hachi Amalei, this is what he said to him. Amanda v'achazuta kaptinan, about the cup and the color of the water I care. So it has to be a full cup and clear water. But ashira lo kaptinan, I don't care about the shear, meaning you don't need to have a revi'it. The Tanya is based on the Braita that we just quoted. May revi'it. Notlin liyadayim le'echad v'afilu l'shnayim. Right? If you have water that's a revi'it, you can use it for one, but even for 2. If you use it for 2, clearly there's not a revi'it for each one. It says the Gemara, but that's different. Mistake. Belohi. Quoting that Braita is a mistake. Shani hata mishum dekatu mishiari tahara. There, the Braita is referring to a case where you started off with more than a revi'it. You can use that for 2 people. So it's true that there isn't a revi'it for each person. But you started off with what's called shiarei tahara, shear of tahara. But if you started off with less than a revi'at, then it would be possible to use for Netilat Yadayim. Okay? That's probably how we paskin. Now, now the question, of course, that comes up, which is the very, very famous question, which is, what's a revi'at, right? How do you know how big the shear is for Netilat Yadayim? So they came up with a great solution. They had weights and standards, as we call them. So Itkin Rav Yaakov min Nahar Pakud. Rav Yaakov in Nahar Pakud made a takana of a natzla bat reviata. He made a natla. Rashi says a natla was a glass cup. I don't know where, exactly why, but they used a glass cup that Rav Yaakov established is a reviat. We'd love to find this and figure out what it is, but right, Rav Yaakov had this glass cup. This is a reviat. So come, they hung it up on I don't know, wherever they hung it. You come here and you check your cup based on this cup of Rav Yaakov. So that was his solution. Itkin Rav Ashi behutzal. Rav Ashi was mitakin in hutzal a kuza bat reviata, kuza, which is a earthenware container. Shalcheres Rashi says that was a reviat. So basically, these rabbis set up for the public a cup that's a standard. If your cup is as big as this one, it's going to be fine. And of course, we don't know what those sizes are, so we can't really benefit from those cups. Continues Rava, Amar Rava, nigufat chavit. Let's say you have the stopper in a barrel, right? So the thing that goes into the barrel to keep it closed. Shetikna, and you were mitakenet, right? Charlie gives us the measurements. I love it. So you were mitaken the migufat chavit. You made basically an indentation in it so that it can contain, say, 4 ounces of water, right? So it's basically the top of a barrel that made a indentation into. Says Rava, that's not a problem. Because it could contain enough liquid or revi'at, you can use that to wash your hands. It doesn't have to be a cup, right? It could be any kind of surface that contains liquid. In fact, the Breita says that explicitly. Migufat chavit shetikna. If you take the top of a barrel and you make it proper, meaning you make a space in it to contain water, and not only that, but chamat ukfisa. Rashi says these are types of leather containers that you would put liquid in. But the same thing would be true about those shetiknan. If you arrange them in such a way that there was an indentation, they could contain water on the outside, you can then use that to pour water onto your hands. However, a sak, the kupa, you're talking about a sack, right? And a kupa, which is another kind of cloth, right? Basically a container, afal even if you design them in such a way that you can make water sit in them, you can never use them. And Rashi says, because really, most of the time, this is very unusual to be done, and therefore we don't allow you to do it. So it has to be something that is usually an option. Now, look, 7 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, question which is somehow well known to many people, even though they don't know the rest of the Gemara. Ma'u lechol b'mappa. Can you eat using a handkerchief? Right? So many probably heard about this concept. But you don't touch the bread, right? So can you eat bread without washing your hands? Let's say you have no water. What if you don't touch the bread? So you use a handkerchief, a mappa, or a napkin, or whatever, and you just...
Or like the wrap of the bagel.
Or the wrap of the bagel, all the tricks. Are you allowed to do that without netilat yadayim? Mi chashina dilma naga. Do you say... Now, the Gemara seems to take for granted that it's not a problem, right? Meaning that as long as you don't touch the bread, you don't have to do it. However, we worry that if we allow you to do this, you're going to mistakenly touch the bread, right? Because you're planning on not touching it, but obviously it's not so simple. So do you worry, dilma naga? Maybe you'll touch the bread inadvertently. Or you don't worry. So that was the question that the Gemara asked. It says in Gemara, we have a proof from a very interesting case that we had in Masechet Sukkah. Tashma, remember that Masechet Sukkah, we were talking about the shear that you need to go eat in your sukkah, right? And so we're going to have a case where there was a very small shear, and Rabbi Tzadok said you don't have to go to the sukkah if you have a small shear. But the way it's said now, Tashma, 7 lines from the bottom, Kishin natznu lo the Rabbi Tzadok ochel pachot mikibetza. When they gave Rabbi Tzadok something to eat, but they gave him it was like hors d'oeuvres, right? So they were walking around and they had little sliders. So they were less than a kibetza, very small sliders. So they would give it to Rabbi Tzadok. He would eat notzlo b'mapa. He would pick it up with a napkin, meaning he didn't wash his hands. He would take the bread, the slider, and he would take it with a napkin. Ve'ochlo chutz l'sukkah, and he would eat it outside of a sukkah because he felt it was so small you didn't have to actually go into the sukkah, assuming it was sukkahs. Ve'ein mevarech acharav, and he didn't make a bracha afterwards. He didn't make birkat hamazon. So he made a bracha before, but it was less than a kibetza. So he touched it with he didn't wash his hands, but he did touch it with a napkin, right? He didn't eat it in the sukkah, and he didn't make a bracha. So what the implication of this is, now how does this prove one way or the other? It says the Gemara, this seems to imply that the only reason he could rely on this heter of using a napkin and not washing his hands is because it was a very small amount. But if it was a larger, a decent amount, even if you used a napkin, it wouldn't be okay. Says Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom, 3 lines from the bottom, 4 lines. My love, ha kibetza, if the food had been the size of a betza, bo'i nitilat yadayim, he would have needed to wash his hands even if he wasn't touching it. So you see that maybe if it's tiny, we don't make a gzera, but if it's big enough to be a betza, you have to wash your hands. So well, that's not a proof. Because Dilma, maybe when we say he didn't wash his hands and he didn't go to the sukkah and he didn't make a bracha afterwards because it was less than a kibetza, the only thing you should learn from that is that if it was a kibetza, he would have to make a bracha and go to the sukkah, but not necessarily wash his hands. Dilma ha kibetza by sukkah ubai bracha, but not necessarily wash his hands. So we don't yet know the answer. Can you take a large hamburger and if you don't have anything to wash or whatever reason you didn't wash, can you pick it up with a napkin and not touch it and eat it regularly? So let's try to prove it from the next case. Tashma. Let's prove it from a case of Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel ashkechei the Rav. Very interesting. We don't very often, right, talk about Rav and Shmuel engaging with each other. Right? We talk all the time about Rav and Shmuel. But this is it's not unheard of, but it's less common. That Shmuel actually bumped into Rav, and Rav was sitting down eating lunch, and Rav was ka'achal b'mapa. Rav was eating with a napkin, so it was very weird, right? Rav was sitting there, and he had his hamburger in a napkin, and so we didn't know why exactly. Shmuel, of course, assumed it's because Rav didn't want to wash, or he didn't have water to wash, and so he was eating his hamburger without touching it. So Amar Le, so Shmuel said to Rav, Avdin Kedin? Amar, he said to him, are you doing the right thing? So Shmuel questioned whether Rav was correct, meaning, why are you eating this without washing your hands? Is that allowed? Amar Le, and Rav said back to Shmuel, you're misinterpreting the whole circumstance. You're assuming that I'm holding this thing with a napkin so that I don't touch it, and that's why I didn't wash my hands. Says Rav, of course I wash my hands. I just get grossed out by hamburgers, right? So da'ati kitzaralai. I'm an istinus. I don't want to touch food, right? So of course I wash my hands, but I want to make sure that it doesn't get on my beautiful new shirt, which is really not what this means, to be clear. It means, I'm grossed out by the food. I'm an istinus, and therefore that's why I'm using a napkin. It has nothing to do with netilat yadayim. Okay, so we still haven't resolved.
Grossed up by the food or grossed up by his hands? Maybe he doesn't have soap.
Say that? Yeah, I agree with you. You're correct, James. That's what Rashi says, by the way. That he feels even if you wash your hands, they didn't have great soap, and so Rashi doesn't say the soap part, but you're probably right. He didn't want to touch the food. He knew about infection. So that was Rav. So we still don't have a proof as to what to do, or is it permitted if you don't touch the food to eat it without doing the tilat yadayim. So Kisolik Rabbi Zera. Second line on Daf Kuf Zayin Amabet. When Reb Zera went up to Eretz Yisrael, so Reb Zera was from Bavel. He, like many people in those days and nowadays, would go to Israel for Sukkot or whatever. So when he went up to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkechinu Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. He found Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi were very famous Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael, right, students of Rabbi Yochanan. He bumped into Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, and he found Dika'achli Bavlai Chamatot, Bibalai Chamatot. They were eating with the worn out chamatot but some piece of leather. It's like, meaning they were basically using worn out pieces of leather as gloves essentially to eat their food. So they were eating in a weird way without touching the food. So he assumed, Reb Zera came from Bavel, that these guys don't feel like you have to do netilat yadayim if you're not touching the food, right? He made a lot of assumptions here as a tourist. So Amar, he said, Trey Gavri Ravri Kavataicho, two great people of high reputation like you, Litob Rav Shmuel. you're making a mistake in the famous story of Rav and Shmuel. Because it seems like you heard the story that that Shmuel showed up and saw Rav sitting and eating a sandwich with gloves on, basically. And you're assuming that means that if you wear gloves or you don't touch the food, you don't have to wash. But you mistook the whole story. Because the whole point of the story was Hadata Katsaraka Amar. The whole point was that Rav didn't want to touch the food with his hands. It had nothing to do with Netilat Yadayim. So you heard the story, but you completely misunderstood it, right? So that was what Rabbi Zera said to Rav Amir Basi. It says the Gemara, no, he made a different mistake. Because really, Ishtamitite, he forgot, Rabbi Zera forgot, Hadda Amar Rav Tachlifa Barvim Amar Shmuel. Rav Tachlifa said in the name of Shmuel, Hitiru mapa lochlei truma, that in fact they allowed you to rely on this mapa trick, on this napkin trick, if you're a Kohen and you're eating truma, because Kohanim are very, very careful. And so that's their behavior. They know to be very careful. And so if they're using a napkin, they're not going to touch the food. But lo hitiru mapa lochlei taharot. They did not permit this mapa trick for those eating regular taharot, meaning they're just makbid to eat food without bitaharat, so that's why you wash your hands, right? Because people will touch it. And Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, Kohanim Havi. Maybe he didn't know because he was just coming to Eretz Yisrael. He didn't know these people. They happened to be Kohanim. And therefore, because they were Kohanim, they were allowed to eat without washing their hands if they didn't touch the food, because we trust that they're really not going to touch it. But a regular person is not necessarily allowed to do that. Okay? So that is sort of seems to come at the end of this Gemara, though I don't know the halacha we paskin that it's a bad idea to do this because we're afraid you're going to touch the food, right? Well, I'm just telling you what the Gemara seems to imply. I don't know how the post can come out. You know?
I believe it's a recommendation if you can't find water.
Our Gemara doesn't quite say that, but I'm saying if you're in a shatat chak, I don't know if there are. I mean, I've heard of people who do this, so there must be some source for it, but it's not from the Gemara we just read.
I do it and then the Ralph's to speak.
Okay, well, maybe you learned the Gemara. Either way, Iboida. Ask the Gemara the next question. What if you don't touch the food, not because you're wearing gloves or a napkin, but because someone else is feeding you? Right? What if you get fed? So, ochel machmat ma'il. If you get fed, someone's feeding you, right? You said you go to I don't think this happens, but you go to a fancy place and they put the food in your mouth, right? I haven't gone there yet. So, ochel machmat ma'il tzarich netilat yadayim olo. Do you have to wash your hands if you don't actually touch the hamburger because they're putting it into your mouth? So Tashma, Rav Huna bar Schora, now there's a good story about this, because Rav Huna bar Schora, Havikoi kamed Rav Hamnuna, he was sitting in front of Rav Hamnuna, and they gave him a sandwich, they gave him a hamburger straight in his mouth. Balam lei umtza, I don't exactly know how this happened, but they stuck umtza literally means a piece of meat. Rashi points out it had to have, Rashi doesn't point out, someone points out, I forgot who, that it had to have, or Rashi Tosas points out, that it had to have a hamburger bun on top of it, otherwise this doesn't make any sense, right? Umsa means a piece of meat, but the top Tosas, as you see here, says obviously there was a bun attached to it, right? So they gave him this hamburger, v'achil, and he ate it. So presumably he didn't wash his hands, right? So he walked into the smorgasbord, and this is a new kind of smorgasbord. The waiters are putting the food in your mouth, right? So they gave it to Rav Hamnuna. He stuck it in his mouth, and Amarle, so Rav Huna bar Schora said to Rav Hamnuna, Loved Rav Hamnuna at lo slina lecha. If you were not Rav Hamnuna, I wouldn't have done this for you. Why? What's for special Rav Hamnuna? Presumably, my taima, la mishum dizahir velo naga. Because he knows Rav Hamnuna is smart enough to know I didn't wash my hands. I'm allowed to eat it if I don't touch it. But sometimes you put food in your mouth and you feel like you got to move it around a little bit. But Rav Hamnuna is going to be careful and not touch the food that was stuck into his mouth. And so you see from here that you're allowed to do it if you're very careful. Answers the Gemara, no, that's not what it means. It's not because Rav Hamnuna was Zahir and he wouldn't touch the food even though he didn't wash his hands. It's Zariz. He is Zariz. Rashi points out, Rashi has a beautiful explanation here, that Zariz is much more aware than Zahir. Zahir means you're aware of the issues. Zariz means that you anticipate what's going to happen. Right? So Zrizim are more careful than Zihirim. Zihirim just means you're going into a situation and you're careful not to do something wrong. Zrizim are people who anticipate what is coming and prepares for the situation. And so obviously if Rav Hamnuna was a Zariz, It means when he walked into the wedding, he washed his hands already. So this, assume that he's already washed his hands, so I can stick the food into your mouth, right? Lo dezariz to kadim umashiyade meikar. He had already washed his hands before, so he didn't need to wash them again, and that's why they fed him without asking any questions. But it implies from here that presumably you do have to wash your hands if someone else is feeding you. Tashma, furthermore, let's learn from a statement. Amar B'Zeir Amar Rav, Lo yitain adam prusa l'toch piv shel shamash. Person should not, right? Let's say you have the shamash. What do you call shamash? The waiter running around, and you have a delicious piece of bread and whatever, or sandwich. You shouldn't feed it to the shamash, ella imkain yodea bo shenotal yadav, unless you know that he already washed his hands. So you're not allowed to feed it to him unless you know that he prepared. And continues the statement of Rav Zera in the name of Rav. Hashamash mevarech al kol kos v'kos. A shamish who, let's say, is the waiter, they give him a drink, they give shots to the bartender, right? So, speaking the language. Okay, so if you have a shamash, you give him a glass of wine from your meal, he's got to make a brei pri hagafen on that. He has to make a brei pri hagafen on every cup that he gets because he never knows if he's going to get another cup. So your dot, when you make the brachas on the cup in front of you, you don't assume you're going to get another one. If they offer you another one 30 minutes later, you got to make another bracha. Okay? Because why would he get cups, right? Ve'eno mevarech al kol prusa, but he doesn't have to make a bracha on every bite that he's given. Again, with the assumption that if you have a big meal, they're going to give me more food to eat. So he makes an assumption that if I make a bracha on the first piece of meat, let's say bread, first piece of bread, I'm going to get more bread. But wine, he doesn't assume he's going to get more wine. And Rabbi Yochanan says, I disagree. Mivarech al kol prusa. That the same thing is true about the pieces. He's a shamash. He doesn't get to eat whatever he wants. So he also has to make a bracha every single bit of food that they give him because he never knows if he's going to get more food. Says Amar Papa, that's not really a problem. It's not really a contradiction. Again, it's not a contradiction. They're different people. But it's not really a disagreement between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Right? Bishma Rav Rabbi Yochanan lo kashya, because it depends on what kind of meal it is. Adam chashuv. If you have a very respected person at the meal, it means there's going to be a ton of food, it's going to be given out freely, and the shamash knows there's a ton of leftovers here. They give me one piece, they're going to give me another piece. So you make a bracha on the first, it counts for everything. But if it's a stingy meal, deleka adam chashuv, then the shamash does not know if he's going to get any more food, and his bracha on one piece does not count for other pieces. Says, okay, that's a good explanation. But however, how do you know that, right, you're implying mikol makom, haka'amar, we said earlier, you're only allowed to feed the shamash, you only can feed the shamash if you know that he washed his hands before. So you see that you can prove from here that if you're feeding another person, they have to wash their hands. Interesting, not necessarily, because a shamash is a unique situation. Shani shamash to tarid. A shamash is different because he's very overwhelmed with work. And so he's not careful, right? That he's not going to touch something, what's the remedy? Yeah, so the worry about a shamash is that he's going to touch things even though he is, because he's so occupied basically with what's going on. And so you should only give food to the shamash if you know that he already washed his hands. Taner Rabbanan, says the Gemara, let's learn this from a Braita. The Braita will expand on this a little bit, right? I'm not the Braita? Yeah. Lo yitain adam prusa shamash. A person should not give a piece of bread or a piece of meat or whatever, something from the meal, to the shamash. Now, Rashi explains it's talking about a guest, right? So if you have a meal in a house and there's 5 guests there, the guests, they're not the balabayit. They should not give from that food to the shamash and say, oh, enjoy some of this, it's delicious. Why? Bein shakos biyado, whether that person is holding the cup of, drinking, basically, it just means you're drinking. Bein shakos biyado shel balabayit, whether or the kos is in the hand of the balabayit, because shema yared davar kilkala b'su'uda. We're worried that something bad will happen in the su'uda. Rashi says because we're worried that the balabayit will get upset, right? If the guest gives food to the shamash, the balabayit on the other side of the room might look and say, wait, don't give away our good sandwiches to the shamash. And we're worried if the balabayit is drinking at that time, he'll choke. because the drink will go down the wrong way. Or if the other person's drinking and he's responding and he tries to tell the shamash to stop, he'll choke. So during meals are very sensitive times. You don't want to talk about sensitive politics or anything. You don't want to upset the balabayit. And so therefore you should not give food to the shamash if you're the guest, because that's a very sensitive issue. The balabayit might be very upset about that, and you might lead to a catastrophe during the meal. Continues the Gemara. Vashamash shalonat al yadav. The shamash who didn't wash his hands before the meal, asur litain prusala toch biv. He's not allowed to put food into his mouth, obviously, because since he didn't wash his hands, he's not allowed to eat the food from the meal. Now, iboy. Okay, so that's the answer of if you're not touching the food someone's feeding you, you're supposed to still wash your hands, except maybe if you're a great, whatever. There might be exceptions, but that's the general rule. Second to last of the narrow lines, the final question before we get to the next Mishnah, iboy. The next question is, what about ma'achil? Right, so we said the person eating has to wash their hands. But what about the person feeding them? If I pick up a sandwich and put it in your mouth, you have to wash. But do I have to wash as the one who's feeding you? I'm touching the bread. So it says the Gemara, Ma'achil tzarich ntilat yadayim o eino tzarich. Tashma. Says Gemara, we have a proof from a very interesting Braita. The Tani Rabbi Menashe, the Bey Menashe, they learned in the Bey Menashe, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, first wide line, Isha midichat yada achat b'mayim v'notenet pat l'bna katan. On Yom Kippur, right? On Yom Kippur, you obviously don't wash, and we don't eat. But children have to eat. So if a woman, a mother in this case, or whatever, a woman, she doesn't have to be the mother, a woman wants to feed a child, says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, she can wash her hand and feed the kid, which seems to very much imply that in order to feed the kid, she has to wash her hand. It's a little bizarre, because the kid doesn't have to wash his hands because he's a minor. But anyways, this is what it seems to imply, right? Now, it continues the Braita. Amru alav al Shammai zaken. They said about Shammai the elder, Shelo ratza lachil biyado achat. He didn't want, Yom Kippur came, Shammai's grandson came to him and said, granddaughter came to him and said, I need a sandwich. Shammai said, I don't want to feed you because I don't want to wash my hand. And the Gazru alav, I don't know who was Gazru alav, but they were gozer on him, they should wash both hands, like a punishment almost. Like you have to wash your hands in order to feed the kid. So it's a pretty clear proof from here that if you're feeding someone, you have to wash your hands. It says Avaya, obviously it's nothing to do with washing your hands for food. There, hata mishum shifta. There, it's because of shifta. What is shifta? Our local family shade, right? The spirits, the evil spirits. Remember that when you wake up in the morning, you have a bad spirit on your hands, and if you don't wash your hands, then that's going to somehow damage the people who touch the food, right? So there, the issue was not washing the hand for netilat yadayim for food, for bread. It was because it was the morning, and Shammai had woken up, or the woman had woken up, and she hadn't yet washed her hands. So says the Braita, you have to wash a hand in order to feed the kid. But it's not because of netilat yadayim for bread. It has to do completely with danger, or with health, with whatever the shifta. Does Rashi say anything here? He doesn't. Right? Oh, ruach ra. Okay, Rashi says whatever, some evil spirit that is on the hands if you don't wash them, but nothing to do with regular netilat yadayim for eating bread. So you can't prove anything from this case. Tashma. Well, we can.
If he would have got rid of this ruach ra in the morning, like we do, we wash our hands first thing in the morning, then he wouldn't have to wash his hands during the day.
Correct.
To feed someone else.
Correct. Well, not necessarily. Rashi goes through that, right?
I don't know. That's what I'm asking you. You go through Rashi.
Yes. Well, it's true. I did. So yeah, that's the point. That we haven't proved it yet. We're about to answer the question, but from here, all the Braita is saying that on Yom Kippur, if you need to feed a child, you can wash a hand in order to feed that child. That's allowed, even though you're not really allowed to wash usually on Yom Kippur.
Right. So does it mean that you would be allowed to wash your full hands instead of like just up to the knuckles, which is what we're supposed to be doing on Yom Kippur? Is that the distinction?
So this does. I don't know anything about these spirits, to be very honest with you. I don't know if they sit on the tip of your fingers, on the knuckles of your fingers. This Gemara is not clear about how much you have to wash to get rid of the spirits, right?
Okay.
But you get rid of them. Rashi's point here, which might be what James was asking, is that presumably, right? What's the question? Do you feed someone? You're washing your hands every morning, so you wash your hands. But obviously, once you're Mesiach Dat, right, we no longer consider your hands tahar. Once you moved your mind onto something else, you weren't paying attention. So you washed off the evil spirits in the morning, but then later in the day, it comes time to feed the kid, right? Are you allowed to wash your hands on Yom Kippur? Or any day, of course. If you're feeding someone else, do you wash your hands before you feed that person? So that's a good question, right? So we have an answer, a really good answer. The answer is Tashma, the third wide line. One day, I love these stories. Avua de Shmuel Ashkeche de Shmuel. The father of Shmuel found his little son Shmuel, right? I don't know if at that time he was called Avua de Shmuel also. The Kabachi. Shmuel was sitting on the side crying. Little Shmuel was crying. And his father, who conveniently was named Avua de Shmuel, said to his son, Amrleya, my kabachita. Why are you crying? And he gave the answer that every small boy has given to his father, because my teacher smacked me. Demachyin Rabbi. I got smacked by my teacher. Or as we called it in my elementary school, you were potched, was the term they used. That's what we used to get to, right? He got smacked by his teacher, so he was crying. So his father said to him, Amai, why did he punish you? And he says, Shmuel said, the Amar Li, because he said to me, my teacher said to me, Kasafita Librai, you're feeding my son. I guess school in those days happened in the house. And there was a little toddler running around. And Shmuel gave the kid a piece of toast, right? V'lo mashiyade, you didn't wash your hands first. So the teacher came over and smacked me for feeding his child without washing my hands. So that's the first part of the story. I love the story. So Shmuel's father said to him, so why didn't you wash your hands? Amai lo mashit. Why didn't you wash your hands? Amalei, and Shmuel said, the best answer in the world, Hu achel v'ani mishina. He's eating. I should wash my hands, right? I'm not the one eating. Amalei, so Shmuel's father said to him, you know something? Lo mistaya de lo gamir. It's not enough that your teacher's an idiot. He didn't learn the Gemara, that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But not only did he not know what he's talking about, Mimcha Nami Machi had the chutzpah to punish you. Right? I love it. I feel like my father said the same thing when I was a kid. But so not only does your teacher not know what he's doing, and you're right, Shmuel, but he was so, he punished you for the wrong thing. And says in fact, that is the halacha. If you're the eating person, because someone else is feeding you, you have to wash your hands. But if you're the feeder, and Shmuel was absolutely correct. There was no need to do Netilat Yadayim to feed this kid, and his teacher was wrong. But I don't know if I'm back to school the next day, but anyways, that was the end of that beautiful story. Okay.
What's the logic behind
says
that?
a note that bringing an opinion from the Gaonim, doesn't cite a source, that Shifta was an illness generally found among young children, that it was infectious disease that can be transmitted by handling food with unclean hands.
Sounds pretty reasonable, to be honest.
Sounds reasonable to me.
So shouldn't the logic be the person handling the food should be washing their hands?
So
Like FDA.
So the gezerah of Netilat Yadayim is on the one eating. What do you mean by logic in that, James? In that,
I mean, in terms of like transferring tuma,
yeah, I mean,
or if there's a concern about infectious diseases,
right. So there's two separate things, right? So Charlie and the Gaonim maybe made into infectious diseases. Tosas quotes the same sort of thing from the Gaonim, but does not say anything about infectious diseases. He says that there's bad spirits that choke children if you don't wash your hands. But maybe that's what they meant by infectious diseases. But so certainly a health issue, yes. That's why the person has to wash their hands, right? If that's a health issue. But from the question of the gezerah of Netilat Yadayim, which is really a gezerah that we made up, right? As we talked before, the gezerah was made on the eater, not on the person handling the food. So if you work in a supermarket and you touch bread, you don't have to wash your hands every time you touch the bread, even though it's true that you would transmit tumah. Obviously, if you're a Kohen eating truma, then everyone who touches the bread has to be tar, right? There's no question. But
isn't the gezerah based on the Kohanim washing their hands before eating?
So gezerah is somewhat based on that, but it's not literally. I mean, we're not tahar nowadays, and we still wash our hands, right? So the requirement to do Netilat Yadayim exists beyond the level of Tuma and Zara. but it's based on that, but it exists beyond that. So in the existence of what we have today, where we're actually not tahar, the requirement is on the eater, not on the handler, to wash their hands. And that's, as the Gemara says, that's how we pass. Let's do the next Mishnah. We could do it quickly. It doesn't have to be quickly, but we will. Says the Mishnah around, where we are in the wide lines. Adam basar gvina bemetpachet achat uvad shelo yeh nogim zeh b'zeh. If you go to the supermarket, you get a pound of cheese and a pound of meat. They can put them together in the same bag, but they shouldn't be touching each other. So you should wrap them in separate plastic, containers. They didn't have plastic, right? But you should not put them touching each other. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, you want to know something? Not more than that. Shnei achsanaim ochlin al shulchan echad. It's actually less than that. 2 guests in your hotel, right, can eat on the same table. Zeh basar v'zeh gvina ve'ein choshishim. One can have a cheese sandwich. One can have a steak sandwich. You don't have to worry that they're going to pass food to each other and try each other's sandwiches. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Why is it a problem if you mix your cheese and your meat together in the same container? Who cares if they touch each other? They're cold. What's wrong with cold cheese touching salami? That's cold, right? So says Gemara, well, no. 1 second. Just because your cheese touches your salami, I understand you can eat them, but you still have to wash them off, right? You don't have to peel off a layer because nothing is absorbed if it's cold and cold. But you need to wash them off. If your cheese touches your salami, you should wash off the edge. And so don't put them in the same container because then you'll have to wash the whole thing. So put them in separate containers. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, Shnei achsanim ochlim al shulchan echad. Amar Rav Chanan bar Ami Amar Shmuel lo shanu el she'im makirim zeh et zeh. The only heter for one person to have a steak sandwich, one person to have a cheese sandwich on the same table is if they don't know each other, because then they're not going to share. Avol makirin zeh et zeh asur. If they know each other and they're friendly, then we're afraid that they're going to say, oh, this is delicious. Try one of my pickles. And the next thing you know, they're going to be eating basar b'chalav. In fact, the Braita says that explicitly. Mishimin Gamliel Omer, 6 lines on the bottom, 7 lines. Shnei achsanaim, shnetarchu lepundak echad. Let's say you've had 2 people show up in a hotel. Zeba min hatzafon, zeba min hadarom. They don't know each other. One comes from the North Riverdale, one comes from South Riverdale. Zeba bechatichato, zeba begnivato. One comes with a piece of meat, and one comes with a piece of cheese. Ochlin al shulchan echad, zeba sar v'zeh gvina ve'ein choshishim. They can sit down and eat it on one table at the same time because you're not worried that they're going to pass food to each other. They only prohibited it if they were in one tfisa, which we think means one sandwich, right? It says, well, what do you mean one sandwich? Obviously that's prohibited, right? I mean, you can't put them together. Where am I? Where am I? Do you really mean one sandwich? No. El mean ke'ein tfisa achat, meaning if they're like maybe on the same tray or the same plate, or they can't be very close to each other. But as long as they're distinct parts, the fact is we're not worried that they're going to pass food to each other. Amar le Rav Yemer bar Shammai l'Abaye. Rav Yemer bar Shammai asked Abaye the important question, which again is a fabulous question. What about if they're brothers? And of course, brothers, we said this is only permitted, they don't know each other. Brothers know each other. But there's a very frequent phenomenon in the world that brothers hate each other. So says Rav Shammai to Rav Abaye, what if they're shnei achim, so they know each other, but makbidin zeh al zeh? They don't get along. They're never going to share their sandwiches with each other. So what do you say then? Do you let them come home and eat on the table, one his steak sandwich and one his cheese sandwich, even because they're not friends, but they definitely know each other? Amalei, so he said back to him, well, of course they can't. What are you going to say? This is a quote, a rabbinic quote. Yomru kol asrikim asurim asrikim baitot mutarim. What are you going to say? You're never allowed to have srikim, but srikim from this house are mutar. What's the background? Rashi goes through, it's on Amud Aleph, Rashi goes through. Remember, we had in Masechet Psachim that you're not allowed to make srikim on Pesach. Srikim were fancy bread arrangements that had like decorations on them, right? Where they would carve or draw beautiful little decorations in their bread before you baked it, so that when it rose, you'd have all kinds of decorations. The problem with that, of course, is that it takes a long time. And we're afraid that the bread's going to turn into chametz. So we prohibited that on Pesach. Now, in the famous bakery of Baitus, they had molds. And they could make these things very quickly without any time delay. So basically, you can make these gorgeous things in 1 second, 10 seconds. So you really should be allowed to do it on Pesach. But says the Gemara, you can't, because what are they going to say? You're never allowed to have these things unless they come from this bakery, which is hard for people to differentiate. So the same thing is the rule. Brothers are prohibited to eat together if one is milk and one is meat. You can't say all brothers are okay unless they hate each other, right? Obviously, it's too hard to find that distinction. And so you therefore it would be prohibited. So it's asur because it's usually asur, even though these brothers don't get along. Is that really true? That we always say that when something is not permitted, you can't make exceptions. Well, Tamech, what about the case of Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Yochanan, which seems to be out of left field? Right? Remember, on Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to wash your clothing. What if you only have one shirt? So said Rabbi Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, if you only have one shirt, mutar lechabso b'chol shamoed. You're allowed to wash it on Chol HaMoed. Says, well, how in the world do the people watching you do the wash know you only have one shirt? Right? So I understand you're allowed to do it, but Yomru, why don't you say the same thing? Kol asrikim asurim misrikei baitud mutarim. That it's always usher, but this guy's allowed to do it. So
you would know because he's saying they're shirtless.
So that's a really good answer. It's not the answer the Gemara gives. So I maybe someone else is washing your shirt for you. I agree with you. I don't remember if the Gemara in Moekan where we talk about this says that, but maybe presumably you sent your wash out, right? So you sent your wash to someone else. This answers the Gemara the following answer: Hatam Amar Mar Baravashi Izuro Mochiach Alav. There's a different proof, which is that there's a belt that was attached to the shirt, and if you had many shirts, when you sent your shirt to the cleaner, you would take off the belt to put on your next shirt. But if you had no more shirts, you would leave your belt attached. So they'll be able to tell from the fact that your belt is attached that this is your only shirt, and that's why you're washing it on Chol HaMoed. So that's the answer. Shavua Toval, 1 quick minute. I can't do tomorrow morning. I apologize. I have to go give a talk somewhere in Midtown. That's not Daf Yomi talk. It's about pancreas cancer, the other topic I talk about. And so
Can it be on Zoom?
My pancreas cancer talk?
Yeah.
I'm going in person. I don't think it's on Zoom. Sorry. But what about, can we learn in the evening before Mincha? Is that possible for anyone? Mincha, I think is around.
I can't do before Mincha. I could do after Marv.
Yeah. I'll be right there. Okay, any other votes? Miriam, can you do after Marv?
I can do it after or before. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, I'm happy to do after. I'll be tired, but I'm happy to do it.
I'm not sure because of family obligations. If I miss it, I'll catch a recording.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to put in the chat. Charlie, do you know what time Marv is?
I have to look. I can look.
Let's put in the chat, and we'll do it then. We'll connect. Okay, I got to run.
I'll just talk now.
Okay, Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
8:30 would be safe because sunset's about 8. Shavua Tov.
Article by Rav Avi, a Jewish link posted, and then they tagged the bite.
Yeah.
Really exploding. 218,000 views.
Which one, Jacques?
Yeah. If I go to our page, it's very funny.
It's very funny.
Like the Eshel post got 1,000. posts get like 500, 1,000. This has 200,000. There's like 10 comments on Instagram. And it says 1,000 more comments on Facebook. That show's posted there. Were you and Shoulder Hero Stephen?
That Levine talked about it. She, at least according to her, Rev Stephen said the mayor didn't really have a response.
Correct. He listened, did not give any, did not have
Even
a
platitudes.
reaction or response, but he is hopeful in this time of hope that
Stephen is.
yeah, there'll be some change.
I appreciate. I don't know how to articulate. Like, I'm glad that's the case because a couple, like Justin Pines said that the mayor was receptive. Vindicated, perhaps, if Stephen, like, a little bit controversial that he went, said what he had to say, and the mayor's still a dick.
That's what Josh said. Josh said, this mayor loves the pain of Jewish people. So I love Stephen going and telling him how many Jewish people that like emboldened him.
No. That's dark. I would say even for Yashi, but no, it's kind of right on brand.
Just from the fact there might be some. No. How do I start the thing? I think I squeeze it in.
And I just update you. So Rami came out and was like, first of all, came out without a shirt. And I was like, I thought the understanding was you wear a shirt when people are over. He's like, I just changed. I was like, I don't, you need a shirt. Feel like you might be hungry. Then he comes back and he said, so Jolie and I are gonna put the carpet down. I said, okay. I was like, I have concerns about like making noise while you're in the master bedroom, like walking around while you're doing it. But like, I guess it's not yet 11. Just like sharing my concern about that. He said, and the Glazermans are having a barbecue tomorrow and I'm invited. And he's like, oh, and I can learn 3 Mishnayot tonight. And I was like, okay. I was like, question would be timing. He's like, well, it's at 1 or 1:30, but Jolie needs to leave at 10. I was like, and you'd be going with her. I said, I feel like getting on top of tomorrow's responsibilities would also probably be a good idea. And he'd like to say he'd return at 5. Said it was a conversation that we all had to have. Doesn't feel like it's last minute. I think I'm probably just aggravated over all of the infractions from Shabbos.
You're talking about it.
Yeah, I don't feel like he's really high strung about the whole thing. And so, like, I guess then the response to that is, okay, we don't have to talk about it. You can't go. We don't have to talk about it. I can make you a drink. I can make you a drink. I can do that. Are you gonna watch the game in here or out there?
Okay.